theme of this talk today is about the unfinished battle for LGBT equality, rights and freedom in the UK. That, of course, presupposes that some of the battles have been finished, have been won. And it's certainly true that if you look back over the last 40 or 50 years, and in particularly over the last 17 years since 1999, we collectively, LGBT people and our straight allies, have achieved enormous positive changes. Let's just think about it for a moment. In 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. And contrary to the popular misconception, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act did not repeal or abolish those laws. Those laws remained on the statute books under the heading of, quote, unnatural offences. Those laws were not finally repealed until 2003, a mere 13 years ago. So think about it. The law against anal sex, passed in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII, was only repealed 13 years ago. The law against gross indecency between men, in other words, any sexual contact other than anal intercourse, the law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895, was only repealed in 2003. It's only in the last 13 years that we've had a penal code that does not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And of course, that's just one aspect of the many laws that have been repealed. The first was in 1999, when the ban on lesbian, gay and bisexual people serving in the armed forces was repealed. Followed soon afterwards by the equalization of the age of consent at 16 for everyone. Followed soon after that by the end to the ban on lesbian and gay couples fostering and adopting children. An end to Section 28 after 15 years on the statute books, inhibiting proper recognition of LGBT issues in the classroom. Then there was finally the ban on discrimination in the workplace, followed a bit later by discrimination, housing, education, advertising, and the provision of goods and services. And we had civil partnerships, and then followed more recently by same-sex marriage. The scale of changes has been phenomenal. There has never been any issue on which so many laws have been repealed so quickly in the entire history of this country. And that is a huge tribute to you and the tens of thousands of other LGBT people and our straight friends and allies who marched, lobbied, wrote, and campaigned to make those changes happen. So I want to ask you to give yourselves and our friends and supporters a huge round of applause. But there is, of course, as the talk title suggests, still unfinished business. Yes, we've got some fantastic new equality laws. I can remember when I was first selected as a Labour parliamentary candidate in Bermondsey in 1981, and when I eventually contested the Bermondsey by-election 2 years later, one of my proposals was a comprehensive Equality Act to prohibit all forms of discrimination, to guarantee every person in this country equal rights and equal protection. I was told by the Labour Party leadership that was a very radical idea and I should play it down. It was too far ahead of public opinion. Well, we did eventually get that in the Equality Act of 2010. But the Equality Act and all the equality laws have written into them limited qualified exemptions for religious organizations. Not just places of worship, but also faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless, and so on. They are all allowed by law to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity if they can demonstrate that it's necessary in order to preserve their, quote, religious ethos. Now, I find that shocking. I find it shocking that faith organizations who ostensibly are based upon principles of love and compassion should want to discriminate, and even worse, that the law allows them to discriminate. No other institution in this country has such exemptions from the equality laws. So as much as I would defend people of faith against discrimination, I expect them to not discriminate against us. And I want to see that loophole closed, to require faith organizations, just like everyone else, to be required by law to not discriminate against LGBT people. And of course, they are. They are. Right now, in this country, ministers of the Church of England who marry their same-sex partner face disciplinary action from the Church of England hierarchy. Even though same-sex marriage is lawful, the church is allowed to discriminate against them. That is wrong, and it has to change. I mentioned same-sex marriage. We finally got it in 2013. But it was never marriage equality. We fought for equal marriage, but we got something second best. What we have now is segregation in marriage law. Separate laws on marriage for opposite sex and same-sex couples. So, opposite-sex couples marry under the 1949 Marriage Act. Same-sex couples marry under the 2013 Marriage Act. Separate is not equal. Even the little tiny Isle of Man, population 80,000, has just legislated same-sex marriage, but not resorted to separate marriage laws. Everyone can marry in the Isle of Man under the 1984 Marriage Act. Gay, straight, bisexual, and trans, they can all marry under that one act. That's what we should have had here in Britain, in England and Wales, rather. We haven't. Also in that legislation is discrimination against trans people, the so-called trans spousal veto, whereby in the case of a couple where one partner is trans, to get a gender recognition certificate, the trans person has to get the permission of their spouse. There's no other part of the law that requires spouses to give permission to their partner. So why should trans people be singled out in this way? There's also discrimination in pension law. A same-sex couple, whether in a civil partnership or a civil marriage, is disadvantaged when one partner dies. The disadvantage is that under the law, a same-sex civil partner or a same-sex marriage partner, if they die, their surviving partner can, by law, only inherit their pension contributions dating back to 2005, or in some circumstances, 1988. So if the deceased partner has been paying into his or her pension since 1960 or 1970, their partner will lose decades of financial contribution to the pension. That does not apply to couples married under the 1949 Act, that is, opposite-sex couples. That is discrimination. And for some couples, older couples in particular, it's a huge financial penalty Some couples are 50, 60, even £100,000 worse off because of that discrimination in pension or inheritance law. There's also, of course, the issue that we have same-sex marriage now in England, Wales, and Scotland, but still not in Northern Ireland. Even though the Assembly there has voted for it, it took 5 or 6 votes, but they eventually voted for it by a narrow margin. But the Democratic Unionist Party, the main loyalist unionist party in the north, used their veto rights under the Northern Ireland Agreement to block same-sex marriage. Now, this veto right was supposed to only be applied when it comes to issues of politics and sectarian rivalry, to ensure that communities are protected. The DUP has abused that process, which was never intended to block equality legislation in order to deny same-sex couples that right. So it's very important that we remember, although we've won in England, Wales, and Scotland, albeit imperfectly, still in Northern Ireland, a part of this country, same-sex couples there are banned by law from marrying the person they love. The final thing I just want to say is a little bit of history. The first legal challenge to the ban on same-sex marriage goes way back to the late 1960s, when 2 trans people sought to get legal recognition. Probably the best-known case is that of April Ashley. When she divorced the man she was married to, she'd married under the 1949 Marriage Act and got away with it. When she sought to divorce her partner and to divide up the marital goods, she was denied recognition as a valid married partner. Even though the 1949 Marriage Act never ever specified that marriage partners have to be male and female. It just talked about 2 people. And so what the government did was then, in response to April Ashley's case and that of another person, and the emergence of the gay liberation movement, the government of 1971 passed the Nullity of Marriage Act. That was the first time in only 1971 that same-sex marriage was banned in this country. Previously, it had never, ever been banned. And when the Nullity of Marriage Act was superseded by the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973, that became the legal basis for the denial of same-sex marriage. In 1992, the LGBT direct action group Outrage, which I was a part of, organized 5 of our same-sex couples to file an application for civil marriage at Westminster Register Office. They turned up with their applications and demanded to have their license issued. The registrar turned around and said, "I'm sorry, you are of the same sex, you can't marry." To which our couples, who were all prime, said, "Where does it say that same-sex couples cannot marry?" The registrar said, "Well, of course, in the 1949 Marriage Act, it's very clear that only a man and a woman can marry each other, not 2 people of the same sex." So our couple said, "Well, I suggest you go and look at the 1949 Marriage Act." The registrar went away and came back about 10 minutes later, ashen-faced. "What on earth is happening here?" she thought. She said, "I'll have to make some phone calls." So after about 45 minutes, she was advised by the Home Office about the existence of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973, which did indeed prohibit same-sex marriage. So those couples were refused, but that was the first serious challenge way back in 1992. And then in 2010, Outrage and a coalition of other groups set up the Equal Love campaign, and we got 4 same-sex couples to file applications again in register offices. and also for opposite-sex couples to file applications for civil partnerships. Because at that time, not only was a same-sex couple banned from having a civil marriage, an opposite-sex couple was banned from having a civil partnership. So there was twin discrimination enshrined in law. And of course, all 8 couples were refused by their local registrars. But those couples didn't take that as the end of it. We organized, with Professor Robert Wintermuth of King's College, one of the world's leading experts on LGBT rights and same-sex marriage, to file an application to the European Court of Human Rights. So those 8 couples filed to repeal the twin bans against same-sex civil marriage and against opposite-sex civil partnerships. And then, as you probably know, we lobbied the Conservative government of David Cameron and said, look, you don't really want to be forced by the European Court of Human Rights to change the law. Why don't you change it yourself and get the credit? Why don't you take the initiative? And eventually we did, thanks to Lynn Featherstone, the Liberal Democrat minister, with her support and that of others, we eventually got the Conservatives, against all odds, to legislate for same-sex marriage. So that's the story. And I've got to say, I can't possibly today give credit and appreciation to all the people who were involved, but there were not just a handful, but thousands of people were part of that campaign, lobbying their members of parliament. In particular, when I persuaded Boris Johnson to support same-sex marriage, although I caught him off the hoof, you may know that after he was first elected Mayor of London, he turned up at the London Pride Parade, and I thought, well, this is a golden opportunity. As he was surrounded by all the media, I barged through and said, Boris Johnson, great to have you here. Will you be supporting an end to the ban on same-sex marriage? And he was caught like a rabbit in the headlights. But eventually, he did say yes. And once he said yes, many other Conservative MPs felt emboldened that they could also say yes. So that gave David Cameron the strength, I think, or the support, the knowledge, that there was support even within his own party. Anyway, that is history. A good history, a history that has brought us at least part of the way towards equal marriage. Some other issues that we need to think about very carefully is, of course, one of them is the still far from satisfactory legal status of trans people. It was a great breakthrough to get the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, which for the first time gave trans people the right to legally change their gender. And it's a huge tribute to organizations like Press for Change and many hundreds of individual trans activists that legislation came about. But it is, to be honest, deeply flawed. It's got a whole series of restrictions and requirements and hoops that trans people have to jump through in order to get a gender recognition certificate. There is now a campaign organized to liberalize the trans legislation, to bring it into line with countries like Malta and Ireland, where there are far fewer restrictions and obligations on trans people, where, for example, there isn't the assumption that you're going to have full surgery. Some trans people want surgery, some people don't. It shouldn't be a pressure or requirement or expectation that a trans person will have surgery or they will have full surgery. That's just one example of the way in which the legislation needs to be reformed. And I think that the whole LGBT movement needs to rally behind the trans movement because we have achieved a lot, but trans people are still some way behind. And so just as they showed us solidarity, we need to show them solidarity to ensure that the unfinished battle for trans rights is completed. Other issues include bullying in our schools. We know from this research that half of all young LGBT people have been bullied in the classroom or the playground, and that nearly half of all schools still have no anti-bullying program that explicitly addresses homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. That's shameful. That's a shameful portrayal of our young LGBT kids. There's also the issue of hate crime. We know, again, from the research that about 1/3 of all LGBT people in this country, that's close to 1 million people, have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime. You know, there's been some shocking celebrated cases, like the kicking to death of Ian Bainham in Trafalgar Square, London. Kicking to death in Trafalgar Square in London, an elderly gay man. It shows that there is no place that's totally safe for LGBT people, and that hate crime is still a problem that needs addressing. So how do we address these issues? The twin issues of bullying and hate crime. One thing we need to do is to ensure that we have mandatory sex and relationship education in every school, not just state schools, but state-funded voluntary schools, faith schools, free schools, academies, independent schools. Every school in this country should be required by law to have age-appropriate sex and relationship education from the very first year of primary school. We owe it to young kids to give them the advice, information, and support they need to make wise, responsible sexual and emotional choices. Yet it ain't happening. And moreover, most of those schools do not include LGBT issues in their sex and relationship education. Now, the Education Select Committee last year strongly recommended, even with the support of Conservative members of Parliament, that sex and relationship education should be mandatory in every school and should be inclusive of LGBT issues. Yet the government has turned that down. Not once or twice, but several times. And there's a big lobby going on, mainly through the Sex Education Forum, which is a coalition of organizations, which is still pressing the government. We're hopeful that now that we have an out lesbian education secretary, Justin Greening, that she will think again, that she will recognize that the right of young people to appropriate sex and relationship education is a fundamental human right. After all, sex and relationships are two of the most important things in most of our lives. Yet we know so many people do unsafe sex, unwanted pregnancies and abortions. So many people are not aware of issues like domestic violence, issues around consent, pornography, abuse. These are all issues that are not being addressed in most of our schools. And to me, it's shocking that we are rightly concerned about the scale of child sexual abuse, yet hardly any school addresses this issue in the classroom. Some will tell kids, oh, phone Childline. I'm sorry, that is not good enough. Not good enough. These issues need to be discussed, and discussed thoroughly with young people, so that if someone is being pestered or actually sexually assaulted, they need to know and have the confidence to report it, and indeed the confidence to say no to abusers, because a lot of the abuse doesn't involve coercion or violence. It's pressure, manipulation, exploitation. And it's because young people don't feel confident in many cases about saying no and reporting abusers that abuse continues. It's got to be addressed in our schools in order to try and roll back the scale of child sexual abuse. The other issue, which is equally important, I mean, sex and relationship education is important to give young people the rights and responsibilities, the information, the knowledge, the skills, the confidence. It's also very important, of course, to give affirmation, positive affirmation, to young LGBT kids, and to make sure that heterosexual peers know and understand the issues, so they'll be more empathetic and understanding to their fellow pupils who are LGBT. But the other issue is, of course, challenging prejudice. We all know that no child is born prejudiced. Young kids become prejudiced because of the negative, bigoted influence of other kids around them, and sometimes even shamefully from adults, family members, neighbors, whatever. We can help change that. If we had equality and diversity lessons in our schools, again, from the first year of primary onwards, to challenge all forms of prejudice, not just homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, but racism, misogyny, prejudice against disabled people, immigrants, refugees. Within a few years, we could fundamentally change things. I'm not saying that every bit of prejudice would be eliminated, but we know from this country and other countries where these lessons have been trialed, the levels of all kinds of prejudice go way, way down. And for those of us who want to live in an inclusive, caring, compassionate society where every citizen, every person feels welcome, every person feels appreciated and understood, these kind of lessons, to me, are obvious and necessary. Yet again, successive governments, even the last Labour government, would not agree to this clearly common sense and much needed proposal. So we need to keep pressing equality and diversity lessons in every school by law so that the independent schools, the free schools and others can't get around it, can't exclude it, can't ignore it. We've made big gains when it comes to blood donations from gay and bisexual men. The lifetime ban has been ended and been replaced by a 12-month deferral period. That is, no person who's gay or bisexual, no man who's gay or bisexual can donate blood if in the preceding 12 months they've had oral or anal sex with another man. Even if they've used a condom, even if both partners test HIV negative. That is an absurd overreaction. Of course, we want to protect the blood supply. That's the number one priority. Patient safety comes first. But you don't have to have those draconian restrictions in order to ensure it. I mean, the deferral period could easily be reduced to 3 months, given that every blood donation is now scanned in 3 different ways, 3 different tests for HIV and selected other sexual infections. If someone has practiced safer sex, if they test HIV negative, and if their blood donation has been screened and comes out negative, then the deferral period could easily and comfortably and safely be reduced to 3 months. And I'm very glad to hear that at last the Government Advisory Board on Blood Donations is now looking at this as an option, whether they go for 3 months or 6 months, but they're recognizing that the 12-month period is excessive and not based on medical or scientific fact. So there's potential progress coming up soon on that issue. Another big issue we continue to face is the plight of LGBT refugees seeking asylum, having fled often viciously homophobic countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Uganda, Nigeria, and so on. You know, these people have come here because they've been at serious risk of imprisonment, torture, execution, or beating by homophobic mobs. My Peter Tatchell Foundation deals with many, many, many refugees who fled horrendous circumstances, including attempts to kill them and to jail them. They've come to Britain to seek a place of refuge. They've come to this country because they think that we are a liberal, tolerant society, because they know that we've signed up to the Refugee Convention. Yet on a first application, the vast majority of LGBT refugees will be refused. A rate of refusal which is much higher than for religious, ethnic, or political refugees. Many of these refugees only finally get asylum status because they have backing from my own foundation or organizations like No Turning Back, UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, and so on. Without that support, without that help to get the evidence, the testimonials, the witness statements, nearly all of them would be refused and be at risk of deportation back to their home country, with a very real risk of imprisonment, torture, sometimes execution, and certainly mob violence. That is truly, truly shocking. And I have to say, it is not just LGBT refugees who get a raw deal. The whole asylum system has been created and set up deliberately to fail as many people as possible. The government's priority driven by the likes of UKIP and the Daily Mail, is to cut the number of refugees. The government is not interested in the individual merits. Its agenda is cut the numbers. And so therefore, a whole series of obstacles have been put in refugees' place. The amount of money available for asylum solicitors to work on a case has been radically cut. On the amount of money available, no solicitor, no good solicitor, could possibly produce a plausible asylum application. The money is not there. Most firms have now dropped out of asylum cases because they feel they can't possibly do a decent application. So the number of solicitors willing to do asylum cases is now much, much smaller, maybe 50 or more % less than it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And that's added to pressure on them, and it also means the level of service and support and professionalism is much diminished, because these solicitors who stick at the legal aid system despite its financial penalties against them personally and their firms, they are driven off their feet, the sheer volume. So we often have really big difficulty in finding a solicitor because the solicitors who do these cases are so overwhelmed. And that's why our support in writing letters on behalf of refugees, helping them or pointing them in the direction of getting witness statements and corroborative evidence, that's why it is so, so important. But every organization working for refugees, whether LGBT or not, every organization is just under such immense pressure. And as you know, many refugees are put into asylum detention centers. These are people, perhaps women who have been raped or gang raped, men who have been tortured, LGBT people who've faced mob violence, minority faiths and ethnicities who've faced threats and attempts to kill them. They've come here to seek a safe haven, and we put them in an asylum detention center, which is effectively a prison by another name. Refugees in asylum detention centers have fewer legal rights than murderers and rapists in our prisons. It's truly, truly, truly shocking. And again, I want to emphasize, you can't just blame the Tories. Labour was at this too. Labour bears a big responsibility because many of the problems that have been created were legislated by the Labour government under Tony Blair. Now, I'm not making a political point, but I just want to make sure people realise this isn't something new. It's been going on a long time. And we need to do something to fulfil our obligations properly under the Refugee Convention for all genuine immigrants and refugees. And particularly now with the war in Syria, we need to be extra mindful of the many LGBT people who are fleeing that conflict. You've all heard about the shocking executions of gay or suspected gay people by ISIS in Syria, throwing them off high buildings, beheading them, crucifying them. This is absolutely scandalous in the modern age. Yet it's happening, and they are coming to Britain to an asylum system which is rigged against them, to an asylum system where they risk being put into a detention centre, having just fled the horrors in Syria. And I've got to say, a little bit off message, I am utterly appalled. I'm a left-winger, and I'm a member of the Green Party, but on the left of the Green Party, I'm horrified by the failure of the left in Western countries to stand with the people of Syria against the Assad dictatorship, Putin's mass bombing of civilian areas, and ISIS. The left has deserted the people of Syria, and when history is written, this will be one of the greatest shames of the Western left. A Guernica is happening. You know Guernica in Spain? The Nazis bombed Guernica. The whole world's left rallied to defend Guernica against the fascists. Yet in Syria today, Aleppo, Homs, Idlib, these are the Guernicas of our age, and the left, the most of the left, is totally silent. No solidarity, no support. In Syria, there are over 500,000 Syrians who belong to democratic, left-wing, and civil society organizations who are non-violent, who are against the Assad dictatorship and against ISIS. Do you ever read about it in the mass media? Does any left-wing journal ever publicize what they're doing? Does anyone know that these groups exist? That 500,000 people belong to these groups. These are absolutely heroic people. And the White Helmets, the civil defense, the equivalent of ARP during Britain in the Second World War, the White Helmets, people who volunteer to go into bombed out areas to rescue civilians who are killed or injured. These people risk their lives every day, and every day they die. Yet people on the left dismiss them as agents of imperialism. Every time I tweet or social media about this issue, I'm denounced for supporting the White Helmets, who we are told are jihadists and agents of imperialism. This is like Stalin did. This is what Stalin did against genuine left-wingers. You know, these people would have supported the execution of Nikolai Bukharin. You know, Nikolai Bukharin, an old Bolshevik, a heroic Bolshevik, was executed by Stalin on trumped-up charges. Sections of the left are now using the same kind of dirty tricks and defamations against genuine Democrats, leftists, and civil society activists in Syria today. I'm a bit off message, I know, about LGBT rights, but these things need to be said. Syria is the great moral test of our time. So finally, I just want to sum up by just giving you some reflections on the global picture for LGBT rights. In about 15 or 20 countries, things are going backwards, quite seriously backwards. You all know about the new law against so-called homosexual propaganda in Russia, passed in 2013. There are similar laws being proposed in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Brunei has now introduced Sharia law, where women who have sex outside of marriage will face execution by stoning, where gay people will face being stoned to death. This is Brunei, a member of the Commonwealth. What is the Commonwealth doing to challenge what Brunei is doing, threatening women and gay people in this way? And also Muslims. Under the new Brunei law, a Muslim person who turns away from their faith, who gives up their faith, could potentially be at risk of execution as well. In Nigeria, they passed a new draconian law 2 years ago, which criminalized the advocacy of LGBT rights, the formation of LGBT organizations, the holding of LGBT events. These are all now outlawed in Nigeria, another member of the Commonwealth. You know, of the 53 Commonwealth member states, 38, that's 70%, still have a total prohibition on same-sex relations. What's the Commonwealth doing? The Commonwealth has a charter which says human rights are a core principle of the Commonwealth, that every Commonwealth citizen in every country is entitled to equal rights and protection against discrimination. Yet, in 70% of Commonwealth countries, not only is homosexuality totally illegal and punishable by life imprisonment in 7 countries. In 7 Commonwealth countries, it is still life imprisonment for homosexuality. On top of that, there's discrimination in housing, employment, child custody, you name it. All these Commonwealth countries, all these 38 Commonwealth countries, and even a few more, have institutional discrimination against LGBT men and women. And the Commonwealth, tight-lipped. You know, the Commonwealth has existed for over 60 years. They've never once discussed LGBT rights. For the last 3 decades that I've been campaigning to get LGBT issues on the Commonwealth agenda, it's been refused every single time. They won't even discuss our human rights. So we've got a really, really, really big problem with the Commonwealth and indeed the wider global picture. Globally, nearly 80 countries still criminalize same-sex relations. And the scary new trend is toward the increasing new criminalization of sex between women. Of the countries that criminalize same-sex relations, now 44% criminalize both male and female homosexuality. And in recent years, 10 countries that never previously criminalized lesbianism have done so. So the trend is towards ever greater legal repression of lesbians in many of these countries. Again, this is an issue which we really are not addressing and not profiling. The issue has been far too male-focused and not recognizing the particular increasing legal penalties on lesbian women. But having said that, let's finish on a positive note. On a positive note, in the last, I think it's 3 years, we have seen some positive advances. The prohibitions on homosexuality have been removed in the following countries in the last 3 years. Nauru, in May this year, Seychelles, Palau, North Cyprus, Mozambique, Sao Tome and Principe, and just this last week, Belize. So the trend is not all bad. It is grim in some countries, but let's keep focused on the positive changes. And overall, despite the setbacks in some countries, the global trend is in our favor. It is moving in the right direction. Queer freedom is an unstoppable global trend because we have love, justice, and compassion on our side. And as we know, all throughout history, even though tyranny and hate can sometimes have its victories, they're only temporary. In the end, love, justice, and equality will triumph. So let's keep our eyes on that goal and support those in this country and around the world who are fighting for the freedom we have been far too long denied. Thank you.